So we're live streaming this Q&A session, so welcome back to those people watching online. For people who saw the Q&A earlier, and obviously for everyone in the room, this one's going to work a little bit differently. Instead of you giving me your questions and me asking the speakers, you're going to ask your questions yourselves. You're going to ask your table facilitator to do that for you. Before we do that, I had a request just to reintroduce the speakers. So we have Tony Juniper from Natural England, Chris Stark from the Committee on Climate Change, and Kirsten Leggatt from 2050 Climate Group. Got it right this time. Excellent. Now, it is important to say that they are represented, although we've given you their organisations for reasons of transparency, they are here representing themselves. It is a personal opinion that they're giving you. So how we're going to do it is we're going to start with Chris. I'm going to take the top question from each of these tables. I'll come round with the mic. Take maybe 3 questions. Chris will answer those. Then I'll take the other questions for Chris. He'll answer those, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. If we have time after doing that for all the speakers, I'll come and take some additional questions from you. But let's see how we go. We've got half an hour. Speakers, pithy answers so we can get through as many questions as possible, please. So I will start over here with this table. Who has your question for Chris?
Will government seriously consider the scientific evidence in looking at all of these issues, or merely pay lip service to it?
Thank you very much. And this table's question for Chris.
Our question is, how can we ensure the cost of changes don't affect poorer people disproportionately?
Thank you very much. And this table here, your question for Chris?
Our table asks, why is religion not playing a much bigger role in changing our habits for the future?
Chris, when you're ready, those answers to those questions, please.
Easy. So, firstly, will government seriously consider the scientific evidence? Well, yes, I hope they will. But I can only say that I hope they will. Now, one reason to think that they might here in the UK is because we have the piece of legislation that hangs over all of this. So there is a piece of legislation called the Climate Change Act, which has been around since 2008. The Act is what is where you will find the target that you are talking about, the net zero target overall. It also establishes a very clear principle that we should be cutting emissions, yes, but also reacting to the science. And the story that some of you may know is that the new target that we have is a net zero target. Until last year, we had a different target, which was an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions measured on 1990 levels. The reason that we've changed that to net zero by 2050 is because the science really strongly says we should. So I am quite optimistic, if I can put it that way, that the government is responding in the right way to the science. The one area where I question, as I sit here before you, that commitment is in the government's commitment to the things that would drive those emissions down. So the language I often use is government policies, the steps that the laws and the steps that the governments do to force those emissions to change. We are not seeing at the moment that they are compatible with the targets that's just been set. And that's, again, one of the things that I'm sure you'll want to talk about. So will government take seriously the science? I hope they will. They are certainly required to by that Act of Parliament. Secondly, how can we ensure that the cost doesn't impact most on poorer people? Well, there's lots of ways in which you can do that. And this is the key question, really, for the Treasury. So the Treasury is the bit of government that looks especially at how we raise taxes and do public spending. They're also very acutely involved in some of the other wider bits of government policy that determine how the economy works. It's very important, I think, for the Treasury to consider that question as they think about the ways in which the government will have to help pay for the transition to the net zero goal that you are talking about today. Just to give you an example of the kind of things that could be done, they could use higher taxes overall. Now, the tax system, the way in which we raise taxes is generally thought to be a fairer way of paying for that, a fairer way of raising money than through other routes, because it raises more from rich people than it does from poor people. So you could think about the Treasury considering an approach where they raise more money and spend more money. That would be one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is that they might put laws in place to ensure that those who are the poorest in society don't face the costs of some of the big steps that, again, you'll be talking about over the next weekend. It's very difficult to give a pithy answer to that, but what I would say in summary is it's essential, and I'm not making a political point here, but it's essential in designing the things that the government will want to do to get to net zero, that the question of how that cost is distributed so that the poorest people, those least able to pay, don't suffer those costs, is right at the heart of it. And thirdly, why is religion not resulting in more action on this? Well, I don't feel I'm able to answer that question directly, but what I might do is offer one outlook on it, which is to say that I have noticed, certainly having worked around this stuff for a number of years now, that recently religion here in this country has become much more vocal on the issues of climate change than it had before. So my observation on it, and it is only my observation, is that that the various religions actually are playing catch up on this, that they are all, but all are coming to the same sort of conclusions, that climate change is almost symptomatic of the way in which we've been treating the planet. And that's a moral issue that's, of course, therefore more valid for religious discussion overall.
Thank you very much, Chris. You're going to have to be a fair amount pithier. This table's question for Chris, please.
What will be the biggest challenge, practically speaking, during the just transition phase?
Thank you very much. Question from this table here for Chris.
It's a bit related to one we've had before. How could we make sure that the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, both economically and geographically, are protected?
If you feel that you've answered that already, I asked them not to change the question if it had already been covered because of time, so you can just say you think it's covered. The question here? No question here? No question here. The question from this table?
Hello, Chris. 3 out of the 7 points you listed were about fairness. I was just wondering who decides who's fair, what's fair, and how?
Chris.
Right, let's be quick on this. So just transition, what's the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge is oil and gas. So the oil and gas sector, which employs many, many, many people right across the world and here in the UK too. The one thing we know is that we can't keep consuming and using those reserves that are coming out of the ground or under the sea to the extent that we use today. So the biggest challenge when it comes to employment issues overall, I think, is that one. And there is a set of choices ahead for that, for people who work in that sector, what we do about that. They could transition into different industries. They might remain in the same industry, but if that's going to be the case, we'll have to have something else alongside that, which you will hear about, which is carbon capture, which is about using those resources but capturing the carbon from doing so. These are really important issues because there's a lot of people who work there, and transitioning that employment to ways in which that are more compatible with climate change is, I think, one of, if not the biggest issues overall. How are the most vulnerable protected? I'm going to say that was probably the answer I gave earlier, but I could talk for hours about that issue, but let's move on from it. 3 out of 7 questions are about fairness. Who decides what's fair? You do. Is my short answer to that, because it is for governments to define what they regard as a fair outcome and to stand and to be elected on that basis. But the most fascinating thing about what we are doing here today is probing further than that. So we're not just looking at some sort of electoral mandate. The fact that you were elected on a host of things that you stood on as a governing party means that you can always question on what basis people really voted for that party. Think of Brexit, for example. That was clearly one of the defining factors in the last election, rather than the topics that we were talking about. What you're doing today is establishing, in one sense, what you regard as the fair outcome here to meet that target that Parliament has set. And that's evidence that we don't have at the moment, in which each of these select committees around us in Parliament will then use when they probe government about what they're doing about meeting the target that Parliament set for them.
Thank you very much. So we'll now move to questions for Kirsten. This table's question for Kirsten, please.
The question was, what can we do to help you be effective, like raising money?
Okay, this table's question for Kirsten, please.
Our question is, what percentage of younger people agree with you, and who do you engage with?
Thank you very much. And the question here?
What would you like to change now?
There you go. Nice small questions for you there. Would you like to answer those?
What can you do to be effective? What can we do to be effective? Right. Talk about it, raise awareness of it, I think is key to all of this, but I also think that we need to start not just, I go to many talks in all that I do, and it's just the same messages being spoken about over and over again, and I think it should be not just, this is what we can do, but giving examples of exactly what you are doing, I think is, a really important part. I think that, for what we do within 2050 Climate Group is individual action, and if you start with your friends and your family and encouraging them to, walk to work rather than, drive, for example. There are other examples, but that kind of starts the ripple, which then moves into a tsunami when more and more people do it. I could go on, so I'm just going to cut it brief there. Percentage of people that agree with me, and who do I engage with? So I volunteer with the 2050 Climate Group in Scotland. The UK Youth Climate Coalition in the UK is a UK-wide organisation. We are in Scotland, we are very closely linked with the Scottish Government. We have lots of other funders as well. In terms of the UK youth, we are very, very closely linked with Youngo, which is the UN. And in terms of the percentages that agree with me, I think there are many people out there that will. I can't give an actual percentage, sorry. And sorry, I can't remember your question now. What would you like to change now? Oh, what would I change now?
Yeah, the question was, what would you like to change now?
Internal flights in the UK. I'm just going to come out and say it. I think it's really important that if you're, there's so many, the work I do for my day job is there is people in my company that will fly to a meeting from Edinburgh to London. The train's 4 hours. That's probably the length of time you're waiting in the airport and then, getting on the flight and at the other end. So I would hope that is something we can solve quite quickly and, tomorrow, hopefully.
Thank you. This table's question for Kirsten, please.
So how can we inspire people who have power and influence to make the necessary changes when the current information on climate change they've been given hasn't been enough so far?
So how can you inspire decision makers to make changes when they haven't done so given the information they've been given so far? This table's question?
Tricky question.
What would be your personal first step at reducing carbon emissions?
My personal first step.
Your personal first step. Again, if you feel you've answered that question already, just say so. If you'd like to give a different answer, feel free. This table's question.
If no action is taken by Parliament after the recommendations from this Assembly, do you think young people will become demoralized and accept the cost of climate change, or will it create a further revolution from young people to demand change?
And this table's question?
Young people own more cars and fly more than previous generations ever did. How can we reverse this, and do you think there is a sincere sentiment of compromise in creating change while sacrificing quality of life in terms of international travel?
Did you get that?
Can you repeat it? That was a long one.
Yes, sorry. Young people own more cars and fly more than previous generations ever did. How can we reverse this? And do you think there is a sincere sentiment of compromise in creating change while sacrificing quality of life in terms of international travel?
Okay. So, inspire decision makers to make, is that the first question?
First question was about what can you do to inspire decision makers to make change, given that they haven't made changes already based on the available information?
That's a really difficult question. I think to me it's obvious that we need to make changes, and so how can we inspire decision makers is, giving them meeting them in a way that they will understand. I think is a big point. So, meeting them halfway. So if they're not prepared to do the whole haul, become vegan, try meat-free Mondays instead. Is kind of like, maybe that is an easier way, and then hopefully when they decide how easy and find out how easy that is, they'll move up in that. Personal first step. I think it all comes down to travel and diet for me, and I walk, get the train, get the bus where I have to, and yeah, I'm vegetarian full time and vegan most of the time, but I still quite like cheese, so sorry. Will young people accept and get demoralized or have further revolution? There will be further revolution. I think that's pretty obvious, I hope. That it's not going to stop. We're not going to accept it, and it's just going to have to we're going to keep up our persistent action until people in power listen, and if that takes as long as it takes. The last question, something that the phrase that I want to pick up on is sacrificing quality of life. I don't think anything that we do to have a better, a lower carbon footprint is sacrificing your quality of life. I do believe that more people, owning a car is expensive as well as high carbon emissions. So I think that is a point there, but we shouldn't be sacrificing. It shouldn't be thinking of sacrificing your way of life, quality of life, because I have a great quality of life and I don't feel like I've sacrificed anything, and I feel like I'm taking all the individual actions that there are. I think we need systems change now, but I think that answers everything. Thank you, everybody.
And for the last round of questions for Tony, then this table's question for Tony, please.
Thank you.
It's a three-part question on trees.
Okay.
The National Trust have planted 20,000 trees. How long before they're effective? How many do you need to be effective? And actually, are forests better than individual trees?
I'll just pause to let you write that down.
Yep. Okay.
Cool. This table's question.
What solutions are available to grow food without soil?
This table's question.
Who would you make responsible for reversing degradation of nature, and how would it be financed?
Start with those.
Okay. So these are all very good questions, and we could spend the rest of our weekend sitting here answering them. I will attempt to be brief. So in relation to trees, how quickly are they effective in removing carbon dioxide? So immediately is the answer, and the quicker they grow, the more carbon they remove from the atmosphere. We do need to have some caution, though, about the extent to which we only see the carbon benefit from tree planting, and the part of the question which is about trees versus forests is very important. So a forest is a living entity with many different dimensions to it, many interactions going on. It would have a lot of different wildlife species in it, and it would be delivering multiple benefits, not simply sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. And this, I think, is the piece of the equation we really need to master as we look at trees as part of the solution, is how those trees can be providing benefits across a whole range of different needs. So I was just saying here to Chris a moment ago that tree planting, in my opinion, should have 8 reasons, 8 headings. One is carbon, one is wildlife, one is landscape beauty, one more is to reduce flood risk, one more is to lead to the purification of rivers by stopping sediments going in, Another good use of trees, especially in cities, is to cut urban air pollution. Another good use of forests, in particular, is for human well-being and recreation and for inspiration. And then an 8th heading is to provide timber, which we can be using to make wooden buildings which hold carbon for centuries. If we start to look at trees like that, and importantly to look at forests as delivering those things probably better than individual trees, then I think we make a lot more progress. Yes, I think that was it. And then food without soil. We can do this as a method called hydroponics. So some companies are looking at moving farming indoors, growing vegetables in very closely controlled conditions where they're being fed nutrients and water inside a closed system. This is becoming economically more viable, not least because of the invention of very low-cost LED lighting. This is enabling the power source to be done very cost-effectively to produce vegetables, at least. I'm not sure what the limits of this technology are, and certainly one would see a continuing need for agriculture in soil for a long time to come. That's one route. Another route you may have seen in George Monbiot's film the other evening, Apocalypse Cow, where he was looking at some of the emerging technologies to be producing food from bacteria in vessels in labs. And another source of food that we're eating all the time, actually, is fish coming from the ocean. There's no soil involved there, but actually what there is an equally complex set of ecological dependencies coming from plankton feeding on sunshine in the top of the sea. So these are all routes. I would, however, expect us to be using soil for a long time to come, and actually agricultural soil can be part of the solution so long as we can find ways to rebuild the organic matter. And what we've done over many decades now is to be replacing the natural fertility that comes from organic matter with industrial fertilizers produced in factories, which have a very big greenhouse gas footprint in their manufacture. If we can go back to putting organic matter back into soils and raising the organic matter, there are some very big numbers out there that scientists have produced showing us that this could be a big part of what we need to do over the coming few decades. So focusing on soils and rebuilding their organic matter, definitely part of the solution alongside some of these emerging technologies. So the part about the finance and the recovery of nature, the question was around who's responsible for nature recovery and how's it going to be financed. Okay, so I think people who manage land, they can be responsible. Governments can take responsibility in terms of the direction of a country. There are people in private sector organisations like water companies and agricultural companies who can take responsibility as well. And all of these institutions between them can finance the recovery of the natural environment. Water companies can, for example, see a real business case in restoring blanket bog as a way of avoiding the need for chemical treatment and technology to get pure water to consumers. If you damage a blanket bog, particles get into the rivers, they go downhill, they get into the raw water treatment. That costs money to get out. Actually far cheaper to invest in the recovery of the blanket bog up the hill. Similar things you can say around the recovery of certain woodlands on hillsides that help us to avoid having to do the clean-up downstream. So there's a revenue stream right there. Government could be paying for nature recovery and will be quite soon through the new Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is a new policy that will pay money to farmers for public goods. Public money for public goods is the idea, and that will in turn be seen in terms of a range of environmental benefits, paying farmers to catch carbon, recover wildlife, clean up rivers, enable public access, create beautiful landscapes to inspire everybody again. That's where the direction of policy is going. So we can do that and we can pay for that. And of course there are other organisations, National Trust as mentioned a moment ago, through their members they're doing some of this work too. So multiple sources of finance. It does however need somebody to create the overall plan, and that's one of the jobs we hope we will be doing at Natural England. We're an official government agency if you didn't pick that up yet, and we advise government on these subjects, and one of the things we're advising them about at the moment is how to create a national nature recovery network.
Okay, thank you. You might have to be a little bit pithier in response to the next one.
Well, they should ask easier questions.
Yes, I mean, that's a fair comment. Over here, if you didn't feel the entirety of your question was answered, I will just come back and check that. You happy? Okay, fine, great. This question.
I apologise straight away. Do you think utilising hemp as a replacement for wood would be beneficial and reduce deforestation? And would reforestation need to be implemented all over the world to be effective, or would it be enough to plant trees only in those countries?
Okay.
Sorry, that was.
I mean, that's technically two questions, but you just got away with that.
Okay.
This table here.
Is the world's overpopulation a bigger impact on the environment than climate change alone?
This table.
If you plant trees to absorb carbon dioxide, can these be put anywhere, or must they be near the sources of CO2?
Okay. Wow, brilliant
Thank you.
questions.
Hold on, one more. You got
Oh, there's
one more.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm running.
How does carbon go into the air by ploughing?
Okay.
You have
Right.
maximum 5 minutes to do that. I'm so sorry.
Okay, right, okay. So hemp versus wood, I don't know. Somebody will have done that, though. Somebody will have worked that out. There's a process, an intellectual process called carbon footprinting, whereby you look at the carbon involved with different processes, and somebody will have done that, I'm sure. In terms of whether we need to plant trees in all countries, yes, we do. So wherever you plant a tree, it will be taking carbon from the atmosphere. Obviously, some countries are more naturally forested than others, and trees grow quicker in some places than others. So trees growing in the tropics grow much more quickly than trees growing in Scandinavia, just because of the climatic conditions. But I think, everyone needs to take responsibility, and it's almost an act of leadership as well as the practicalities of carbon capture. And the remarks I made a moment ago about the multiple benefits of trees, we want to do it anyway. It's not just the carbon thing. So I think putting them in all countries, well, some countries are not naturally forested, so you wouldn't want to do it in those places, but the ones that are, you probably would benefit from more of it. Is overpopulation a bigger threat? What we find as we delve into these subjects is we find all these things are related to one another. So one of the reasons why there is a big climatic and ecological problem right now is because we've had a very rapidly rising population. It literally has been a population explosion. What to do about that is a very complicated question in terms of can we slow down the rate of growth, and yes, we probably can, but more importantly is to look at the fact that the numbers in terms of the climate and the ecological damage is really linked to what people do rather than how many people there are. So whenever you look at population, it's vital to look at consumption patterns. So a person living in sub-Saharan Africa, living in a village, basic agriculture and local economy, is probably got a carbon footprint 1% of somebody living in the West and flying on aeroplanes on their holidays the whole time. So the population thing is important, but it cannot be disentangled from the consumption part of the equation. Can we put trees anywhere to catch the carbon? Yes, we can. So the carbon I'm breathing into the atmosphere this evening, right now, this will be pretty much evenly distributed into the atmosphere of the entire planet within about 18 months. And so the carbon that we're putting out is truly, literally a global problem. And everywhere we make a local intervention, it's going to make a difference on the global stage. So we don't need to put the trees near to the carbon sources. The carbon is diffused once it's out, it spreads out. And so trees can pick that up anywhere. So we don't need to focus in that way. And carbon, yes, into the atmosphere from ploughing. So organic matter, so if you can imagine a plant growing above the ground, it's basically shedding dead material onto the surface of the soil. The worms and other organisms drag that into the soil, the bacteria and the fungi get to work on it, and that flow of organic material is the organic matter in the soil. When we plough soil and we put too many crops in there that are very demanding, the organic matter goes down. And one reason for that is because when you expose organic matter to the atmosphere, the carbon meets oxygen and the soil literally evaporates, turns into carbon dioxide. This is particularly prevalent in peatlands that are covered in water. So peatlands are wetland ecosystems. When we drain them to get at the peat to grow crops or to change them for some other reason, then the peat is exposed to the air, and the carbon that's been accumulated in this wetland, it's layer upon layer of dead plants that don't rot because they're kept in this moist condition. Then when you remove the water by digging drains, which is what we've done all over the peatlands of England, then the peat starts to turn into atmosphere. So in peatlands, this is a particularly big problem, considering that the biggest terrestrial carbon store we've got here is in those peat soils. So restoring our peatlands is a really big priority as a result of exactly that issue of organic matter turning into gas. And it's a similar process in agricultural soils, but also it's cropping there as well. We're removing the organic matter as a result of growing loads of plants in there to eat. And then, as I say, we're not putting the organic matter back very often. We're replacing it with ammonium nitrate, a fertilizer that comes out of bags, which is produced with a very high carbon footprint. That's the short answer to that, I think.
So, can we say a big thank you to our panellists, please? Thank you very much. So Kathy, support team, Kathy. Kathy at the back, who's waving at you, panellists, she's going to whiz you down to the other room. So off you go. People in here, just have a chat at your tables and we'll wait for the other panellists to get up here for their Q&A.